there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up and ranking for the Booktube Prize. I was reading in the nonfiction category in Group D. Look at the props. Kind of as an aside, the thing that surprised me the most this year compared to any of the groups I was reading last year was just how long the hold lists were for, except for Paradise Falls here, the hold lists on everything were endless. And you can see I only have 3 physically here, and that's because the other ones I had to join secondary libraries to even get e-copies. It's interesting how much more popular these were than the books I had to read last year. As I said, Paradise Falls was the first one that I got because it was the only one that did not have an endless hold on it. The subheading on this one is The True Story of an Environmental Catastrophe. It's written by Keith O'Brien, and it's a portrait of the community activism that popped up in the 1970s based on this subdivision in kind of suburban Buffalo that had been built over an old chemical waste dump where a canal had been semi-built. When the full build didn't go through, this chemical company just used it as a dumping ground. It was later sold to the city. It was turned into this subdivision. So these families who were living there in the 70s discovered that their children had a lot of diseases. They follow one family where one of the children started having seizures and kids died. Disproportionate number of pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Chemicals were seeping out of the schoolyard because the school was built over this dump as well. So it talks quite a bit about the community, about the activism, about Hooker Chemical, which is the company that did the dumping in the 40s and the 50s. There's some details about the various health issues and where else things like that were found. About a third of the book is character portraits of people who were involved in the activism. And up until that point, I had thought this was a really compelling and quick-moving book, like the kind of narrative nonfiction you want to read. I kept comparing it to Kate Moore's Radium Girls, because I thought it was similarly compelling to that. Like, that is something that it was turned into a play and it was turned into a comic, and that's one of those books that's widely read by people who don't always read nonfiction. And this was similar to that until we hit the final third, where it gets into a lot of excessive detail involving some of the community activism, and one of them who became almost a celebrity of the time, and how they were on talk shows and there was a made-for-TV movie about them. And all of that seemed like too much. It ground the progress of everything to a halt. It was really unfortunate because then you jump into the final chapters and you hear about what some of these people are doing now, and how there's one woman in particular who's in her 80s and still an environmental activist. And that's interesting, but there's just this chunk of the final third that is incredibly slow-moving in a way that I don't think you want. This style of journalism that's supposed to be fast-moving, it's just at odds with what the book is trying to do otherwise, which is a shame. I was personally kind of more interested in it than I would have been in maybe some cases like this, just because this is right across the border. So every time I drive into the US, you essentially go right past there, so that was fun. I had a lady that I met at the dog park who is in her, I guess, mid to late 60s, so she's old enough to remember this, and she was already in Canada or in Toronto at the time that it happened. And I told her I was reading this book. She was telling me how it was portrayed in the news at that time, so that was interesting as an aside. But yeah, I thought this was quite good for 2/3 of it, and then 1/3 it just sort of fell off. Like, this is 455 pages, basically at least 50 of them are notes and references, but I thought of the narrative itself, at least 50 pages could have come out of that. It did not need to be as long as it was for the kind of book that it is. The next book that I got a hold of was His Name is George Floyd, the subheading on which is One Man's Life and the Struggle for Racial Justice by Robert Samuels. The title implies that it's a biography of George Floyd, which it is, but it's using that biography to carry essentially a US social history. There are points in his life where they're talking about schools in Houston not really desegregating in the 70s even, Reagan's war on drugs, and how that ended up giving all kinds of people who really didn't need to have these prison sentences, which meant they weren't going to be able to get jobs later because they had a criminal record, etc., etc. And here's the social picture, and here's the picture of this one man. And I think it's really compelling, and it is compellingly done. There are some scenes in this that are incredibly moving, both the ones that you expect that are about his murder in particular, but also just so many bits and pieces of the social history. And I thought it's a really clever way to do that, because I mean, people always say the cliche, well, the personal is the political, but this is a great example of how true that is. I don't really have a negative about this, except within the context of the Booktube Prize in particular. It's excellent, but it's not the best social history of the United States that I've read, and both last year's winner and the winner the year before were social histories of the United States. So if I'm thinking in the Booktube Prize box, I'm like, well, this is good, but is it as good as the other social histories of the United States that we had to read? And I don't know that it is, but if I were recommending this, if I saw somebody picking this up who hadn't read any of those other books, yeah, I would tell them this was a good book. So that doesn't feel like a real complaint. In the context, it feels repetitive, but that is exclusively because I was reading this for the Booktube Prize. That wouldn't be something I even thought of if I were reading this on my own. So after that, I listened to the audio version of Ed Yong's An Immense World, How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Among Us. Not among us, around us. This is a work of pop science or pop natural history, not really natural history, pop biology, in which we look at the different senses and then he goes into how they work in different species. And not just in species where one is stronger than the other, like we have a nose, but our dog's noses are much stronger, but deeper than that. Senses that certain species don't have, or that are where the perceptions are completely different and you can't even guess at what it would be like to experience the world through that animal's senses, because their experience of color is so different, for example. Or how we talk about ultraviolet like it's exciting, but if you were a bee, you'd think some of the things that humans see that bees can't see would be exciting, even though they, and so on and so forth. That have polar detection abilities, or heat detection abilities beyond just the sense of touch, or that have electroconductive abilities, and not just eels zapping the water, but what does that actually do, and how do they see quote unquote the world? So it's just fantastic that way. I mean, it's a huge collection of trivia, and it does everything you want from a huge collection of trivia. This was just really fantastic. And it's really interesting how there's this emphasis on how almost impossible it is to even dream up what tests you should be doing to see what the certain animal perceives, because we're so locked into what we can perceive that how do you even notice that this other animal is perceiving the world in this completely different way that we don't even have a sensory equivalent to. So that's fantastic. And then it wraps up with a point about how there are so many ways of being and ways of perceiving that we lose when species disappear. And so you get this sad ending, which I think is great too, because it kind of locks it in emotionally. Is that a weird way to say that? But yeah, I think this did everything that you want in a pop biology book. You're not getting huge depth into any of the studies that are mentioned, but that is not what you expect in a pop biology book, right? You can go to the reference section and read the actual studies if that's what you want, so it's a great launching pad for that as well. But yeah, I thought this was top-notch. So after 2 excellent reads and 1 okay one, I was set for a dud, which I actually did have out of the library, and I don't know where I've put it now, so I'm gonna have to look for that now. I better not have... Imagine I end up with a fine for this book I didn't like. Anyway, that book was Dinners with Ruth, a memoir on the power of friendships by Nita Totenberg. So this author is an NPR reporter, and I think this book will have the most appeal to people who listen to her on NPR. I wasn't familiar with her, so going into something like this, which is a bit of a celebrity memoir, I think you are, unless they're talking about one particular thing and you're interested in that particular thing, I don't think any of these, I think it's going in almost at a negative to begin with, to not know who the person is. So full disclosure, I didn't know who she was. Despite the title and the title photo, which makes it look like it's specifically about her friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, this is about multiple friendships. I feel like the title is just so people who, I don't know, are curious about Ruth Bader Ginsburg are going to pick up this book and think they're going to get some gossip. You do not get much U.S. Supreme Court gossip in this, although you do get... One of the things that this did have me questioning is how much journalistic integrity can you have when you're socializing with the people that you report on? That brought up questions that never really get dealt with, because the book isn't about that. It's the author talking about her various friendships, her first husband, her second husband, her Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but other people as well. So it's a bit unsatisfying that way, because I felt like there's a lot of things going on the side, like it's a lot of rich people problems a lot of the time too, so it's a bit annoying that way, in addition to making me question her journalistic integrity. So as an introduction to a popular figure that I wasn't aware of, this is not giving me a great impression of her. Like, I don't think it should be an unsurmountable challenge to read a celebrity memoir from a celebrity you don't know. But in this one, I feel like, yeah, it didn't do anything for me. And I think it might do something more for people who are fans of hers. Although that said, I saw Books and Cooks talked about this book, and she has heard Nina Totenberg on NPR and disliked this, and disliked it for the journalistic integrity reasons, even more strongly than I disliked it. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you'll like it even less if you know who she is. I don't know, but this was definitely the worst in my group. And then I got to listen to the audio version of the book that I had been looking forward to the most in this group, and that was Maria Rissa's How to Stand Up to a Dictator. Now, I thought this was going to be far more political than it actually is. She reported for CNN in Indonesia 30 plus years ago. She has been back in the Philippines since then, where she was working first for television and then founded Rappler, which is a news website, and had a lot of experience in the kind of fake news and government repression of news and so on and so forth. So I expected this to be far more about the politics, and it just isn't. The first quarter or so is just a straightforward memoir about her life, her childhood. She moved to the US at a fairly young age, and then lived there until she finished university when she moved back to the Philippines. And I guess the meat of this is more about talking about how Rappler was founded and some of the behind the scenes bits when she was working in television. And I think a lot of that would be interesting specifically to people who are interested in journalism as a craft, or journalism as an art, or journalism as a science, however you want to frame that. I think that would be better for that audience. As someone who is going into this hoping for more political talk, it's just not really there. I mean, it's political in the sense that the whole pushing of propaganda and misinformation, which is a big thing that's in there, and also the fact that she had to go to court and was charged with all kinds of things for reporting real news. All of that obviously is political, but I was expecting far more ramping up to that, and it's just not there. It is primarily about the nuts and bolts of starting new forms of journalism and changing how you do things in television and changing how you do things on a news website. So if you are interested in that, I think this will be good for me. Not just that I was disappointed. You can see this is the CD version. I fell asleep while listening to this. It literally, not as in, oh, it was so boring it put me to sleep. I literally fell asleep. So yeah, that was disappointing, but it won't be for everyone. And I think especially if you're a journalist or you're interested in journalism, that will be more for you than it was for me. And finally, the book that I thought I was going to have to buy, but it finally came in a week before we had to submit votes, was We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Modern Ireland by Fintan O'Toole. This is another book that mixes history with a person's life, and it's the author's life. He was born in 1958, which he reminds you of dozens of times in the first two chapters. Because every time he talks about something that happened in 1958 or started in 1958, he will say, in the year that I was born, which I didn't love, but we'll get to that next. So the history of modern Ireland is fascinating, and I hadn't realized just how little progress economically and everything had been made between 1919 and 1958. I think in the kind of popular consciousness, I had known Ireland was a very poor country under British rule. I mean, obviously the North is still a part of Britain, but the part that's the Republic of Ireland now, I knew it was poor in the 1800s. I hadn't realized how far along, how well into the middle of the 20th century they still were. He's talking about how in the late 50s, half the country still didn't have indoor plumbing, and how the rest of the non-Eastern Bloc Europe were talking about their four poorest countries, and it was Greece, Turkey, Ireland, and Iceland. I hadn't realized that they were still at that point in the 50s, so in that context it's fascinating just how much economic and social and everything, basically every kind of progress. When you think about, in 1958 there were still such heavy immigration that more people who had been born in Ireland lived overseas than lived in the country, and today it's a country people move to. So it's fascinating how, I mean, even just the economic part, without everything else, how they turned that around and so quickly. So that's interesting in and of itself, and I would have loved this book if it was exclusively that history. However, it's not. It's also the author interjecting his own bits and pieces about, so when he's talking about how the Catholic Church controlled Ireland in so many ways, and left a lot of the social pieces regressive for a long time. And I mean, this has been in the news recently even. But then he has to tell you how he was an altar boy, and I didn't care. Now, again, this is something that's very down to taste, so I can't necessarily complain about that much because, while I didn't like it, you might. It felt very much to me like when you're at a wedding and you're trapped talking to somebody's uncle, and they're telling you about their lives. If you like listening to that chatty uncle, I think you will enjoy this a lot more than I did. I wished that every time he talked about himself, I wanted him to get back to the general history, which I think, as a kind of broad-ranging, broad appeal thing, is disappointing, because I think there is a way to do that so that it's interesting to a wider variety of people, and that it wasn't particularly interesting to me isn't the end of the world, because I can see where it would appeal to other people, but I thought it could have been done a little bit better. But, you know, your mileage may vary. It was still fascinating. It was a bit of the reverse of How to Stand Up to a Dictator, in that it did give me a lot of the political stuff that I wanted to know about, so I was happy I was getting that. Alright, so rankings. In number 1, it has to be An Immense World. It did everything that you want a nature or pop science book to do. It ties it all together with the emotional appeal at the end about how when a species disappears, we lose their entire Umfeld and all of that. Great stuff. In number 2, his name is George Floyd, because it's an excellent social history wrapped up in a biography, and I think that's a really clever presentation, because it will maybe get people to read a social history who would normally not read any nonfiction other than biographies and memoirs, because there are a lot of people like that. Deciding between numbers 3, 4, and 5 was tough, because I think they all had strong points, and there's a decent argument, I think, for all of them. I had to go with We Don't Know Ourselves in number 3, just because, in part because even though I didn't enjoy the personal bits, I know that there is a market for that, and some people are going to love this, and especially love it for that element. So I have to say that I appreciate that, even though I didn't like it. And secondly, I enjoyed all the history. I learned a lot, which is something that I like to be able to say when I've read a book that's about a topic I haven't read much about before, so that was great. I had similarly mixed feelings about How to Stand Up to a Dictator, but I feel like the fact that I literally fell asleep while listening to it means it has to go in number 5. So because of that, it means number 4 has to be Paradise Falls, which 2/3 of it I thought was very good. 1/3, maybe it needed to be edited down, but it does most of what it should be doing. And as I said, Dinners with Ruth has to be last. First of all, I didn't like it, but I appreciate that I'm not really the target market for it. But even so, I don't think it's good for the target market. I think the title makes people think it's actually more about Ruth Bader Ginsburg than it actually is, which it isn't. I think as a partial memoir from a journalist, you don't want to go into that and think, wow, I question your integrity now. I don't think that's what the author intended, but that is 100% what you have to do when you read this. And so, yeah, it was not good. At least it was short, though. I don't think there was enough meat there, so even if you're a fan, and even if you're looking for Supreme Court gossip, I don't think it's that good. But let me know if you disagree with me on that. That's fair enough. Anyway, that was my take on Nonfiction Group D. If you read this group, I'd love to hear what your rankings are. And if you had a different group assignment, I'd love to hear how that went. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.